The shuttle that carried envoy Mara Solin to the grand conclave of the Vreth Dominion was, by design, unremarkable. No escort, no visible weapons array, no military transponder riding underneath the diplomatic signal. Humanity had learned, across centuries of contact with other civilizations, that arriving with a fist raised invited the universe to raise one back. So they arrived with open hands instead, and let other species spend years trying to figure out why that somehow felt more dangerous. Mara herself was 43, dark-haired, with the particular brand of patient exhaustion that lived permanently behind the eyes of career diplomats. She had spent 11 years negotiating resource-sharing agreements along the outer spiral, and had once talked a Gavri warlord out of glassing an agricultural moon using nothing but a shared meal and 3 hours of uninterrupted listening. She was, by any measure, exceptional at her work. Her aide was named Calder. He sat across from her in the shuttle's small cabin, watching the Vreth home system resolve from a smear of light into distinct hard shapes through the viewport. He was lean, dressed in the plain gray of diplomatic staff, with pale eyes the color of old ice. He had a forgettable face, the kind that slipped out of memory the moment you looked away, and he said very little. He had, as far as anyone on Mara's staff could recall, always said very little. "You've read the Dominion's current political brief?" Mara asked, without looking up from her documents. "Yes," Calder said. "They're not going to like the water rights revision." "No," Calder agreed, "they won't." Mara finally looked up at him. There was something in his stillness that she had never quite gotten used to, even after 4 years of working alongside him. Not a threatening stillness. Nothing about Calder was threatening on the surface. More like the stillness of very deep water, the kind where you couldn't see the bottom and had quietly stopped trying. "Do you think it'll go badly?" she asked. Calder considered this with what appeared to be genuine thought. "I think it will go exactly as it needs to go," he said. It was the sort of answer that sounded reassuring until you sat with it long enough. The Grand Conclave occupied the upper third of the Vreth Dominion's administrative citadel, a vast, vaulted chamber designed to impress upon visiting delegations the scale of Vreth ambition. High Counselor Vrethon presided from a raised dais at the chamber's center, flanked by 16 secondary counselors, and surrounded by 400 representatives from client states, allied systems, and neutral observers who had come to watch humanity either capitulate on water rights or provide a satisfying spectacle. Mara took her seat at the negotiating table. Calder stood behind her left shoulder, as he always did, hands clasped loosely at his back. The session proceeded for 2 hours. Mara presented the revised framework, the Vreth countered, the language grew sharp but remained, technically, diplomatic. Then, at the 3rd hour, High Counselor Vrethon raised one long, blue-scaled hand, and everything changed. The chamber doors sealed with a sound like a coffin lid. 12 Dominion guards stepped forward from alcoves that had appeared empty. 2 of them reached Mara's chair before she had fully processed what was happening, and they were professional enough that it was over in seconds. Her documents scattered, her wrists secured in magnetic restraints, her voice cutting off mid-sentence as the realization arrived. "Envoy Solin," Vrethon announced to the chamber, to the recording feeds, to the galaxy, "is hereby detained as a political instrument of renegotiation, pending humanity's formal withdrawal from the Outer Spiral Water Compact." The assembled delegations erupted. Shouts, demands, the scrape of chairs. The Shivari elder at the far end of the observer gallery went very, very still. Mara looked at Calder. He had not moved. The guards had not approached him. He was, after all, just an aide, unarmed, unimportant. He stood exactly where he had stood for the past 3 hours, hands still loosely clasped, watching Vrethon with an expression of mild, patient attention. It was the expression the Shivari elder would later write in her personal log, of someone who had been here before, many times, and had never once needed to rush. The Shivari elder's name was Counselor Evith, and she was 412 years old, which made her one of the oldest living diplomatic witnesses in the Galactic Compact. She had attended the signing of the Peripheral Armistice. She had been present when the Orin Collective made first contact with humanity 2 centuries ago. She had watched, across a long lifetime of careful observation, as the political landscape of the known galaxy shifted and reformed like sand under tide. She had also seen the Aide before. She was certain of it the moment her eyes found him across the chaos of the conclave chamber, certain in the way that very old memories sometimes surface, not as thought but as sensation, a cold recognition that bypasses the rational mind entirely. She had seen that face, those pale eyes, that particular quality of stillness. But she couldn't place when, and that, more than anything else happening in the chamber, frightened her. While the Vreth guards processed the commotion and Vrethon delivered her prepared statement to the recording feeds, Edith slipped out of the observer gallery and found a quiet terminal in the conclave's administrative annex. Her access codes, courtesy of her compact seniority, opened most doors. She started with the current mission roster. Calder, listed as diplomatic attaché assigned to Envoy Solen's office 4 years prior. Place of origin, Terra. Date of birth, unlisted. Administrative oversight, no other records. Administrative oversight, on a compact registered diplomatic credential. She went deeper, pulled Envoy Solen's full mission history, cross-referenced the staff manifests, found Calder there 4 years back, attached without explanation or preceding employment record, as if he had simply materialized one day and been filed away without question. Then she searched backward through the Compact's historical diplomatic archives, using his physical description as the search parameter, because she had no name to work with beyond the single word listed on current rosters. The first hit stopped her breathing. Ambassador Yale Prakash, the Keth Sovereignty Crisis 2341, Staff Manifest, 1 diplomatic attaché, physical description matching pale eyes, lean build, forgettable features, gray staff uniform, name listed as C. Adler. The second hit arrived before she had processed the first. Envoy Hiroshi Hess, Terran's second expansion negotiations 2287, Staff Manifest, 1 senior attaché, same description, name listed as Calder. Third hit. First contact delegation to the Orin Collective, 2189. She had been there. She had been 27 years old, newly appointed to the Shivari Observer Corps, and she had stood in the receiving bay of the Orin station and watched the human delegation come through the airlock. 4 diplomats, 1 aide. She could not remember the aide's face now. It was 200 years ago, but the record confirmed. 1 attaché, same physical description, unlisted date of birth, name listed as Calder. 2189, 2287, 2341, and now present day. The same face, the same name near enough, the same position, always 1 step behind the diplomat, never in front, never in the official photographs, never quoted in any record, never cited in any treaty, never interviewed, never promoted, never transferred. Always there. Edith sat back from the terminal and pressed her hands flat on the desk to stop them from shaking. She was 412 years old, and she had made a career out of not panicking, and she was very close to panicking now. She pulled the Keth Sovereignty file, not the public summary, the full internal compact record, which required a security tier she had only because of her age and standing, and which she had never previously had reason to access. It was sealed, not by humanity, by the compact itself, under a classification she had never seen before, designation Stillwater, reason for sealing, prevention of galactic diplomatic destabilization. She had the clearance to open it. Her hand hovered over the confirmation key. Down the corridor, she could still hear the Vreth Dominion's guards managing the commotion. She could hear Vrethon's voice, confident and loud, explaining to the galaxy that humanity had finally been brought to the table on Dominion terms. Edith pressed the key. She began to read, And the longer she read, the quieter the room around her seemed to become, as though the universe itself were holding its breath. The Vreth Dominion's broadcast reached every system in the Galactic Compact within 40 minutes of the seizure. It was, by the standards of political theater, expertly produced. Crisp footage of Mara Solen being escorted from the negotiating chamber. Vrethon's prepared statement delivered with the measured confidence of someone who had rehearsed it many times. The formal list of demands scrolling beneath the feed in clean, readable text. Chief among the demands, full human withdrawal from the outer Spiral Water Compact, ceding resource rights across 7 contested systems, and a formal acknowledgement that the Vreth Dominion held primacy in the peripheral zone negotiations. The deadline was 21 standard days. The implicit message was older than politics. We have your person, and we are not afraid of you. The Dominion's intelligence assessment of humanity had taken 11 years to compile and was considered, within the Vreth military apparatus, something close to definitive. They knew the human fleet composition, formidable but not overwhelming. They knew the human ground forces exceptional, but deployed thinly across a wide territory. They knew, most importantly, that humans attached enormous cultural significance to individual lives, that their political systems were sensitive to public pressure, and that taking a high-profile diplomat would generate exactly the kind of domestic outrage that would push the human government toward concession rather than conflict. They had, in other words, done their homework. Earth's response arrived 6 hours later. It was not a fleet. It was not a counter-broadcast. It was a single communiqué transmitted on open frequencies, unencrypted, available to every receiver in the compact. It was 3 sentences long. The first sentence acknowledged the seizure. The second sentence stated that Envoy Mara Solen was under the full protection of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. The third sentence said, "We are aware." That was all. No demands, no deadline, no fleet coordinates, no posturing, no threats, no formal invocation of the Compact's hostage protection clauses, which every other species would have filed within the hour. Just 3 sentences, the last of which, "we are aware," sat in the minds of everyone who read it with the particular unease of a phrase that could mean almost anything, and somehow, because of that, meant everything. High Counselor Vrethon read the communiqué twice and laughed. 3 sentences, she told her senior staff, and there was genuine amusement in it. They sent us 3 sentences. No fleet movement, no compact petition, no emergency session requested. 3 sentences. She set the communiqué down. We have broken them. Her staff agreed vocally, because that was what her staff did. In the observer gallery, the mood was substantially different. The Oran ambassador, whose name was Tessavale and who had been alive for 900 years and had personally witnessed the expansion of 4 galactic civilizations, had gone the color of old ash. She was reading the communiqué on her personal display, and she was not laughing. The delegate beside her, a young Pelushian, newly appointed, who had studied galactic diplomacy for 6 years and thought he understood how these situations worked, leaned over and asked why she looked so alarmed. The third sentence, Tessavale said. What about it? It isn't addressed to the Vreth Dominion, she said. It's addressed to something else, to whatever is already there. She set her display down carefully, as though it had become fragile. I have seen humans send fleets. I have seen humans send armies. I have seen them negotiate and threaten and maneuver. But I have never, in 900 years, seen them send a message like this. What does it mean? The Pelushian asked. Tessavale looked across the chamber to where Calder stood, still and unhurried, watching the room with those pale, patient eyes. It means they don't need to send anything else, she said quietly. It means whatever needs to happen is already standing in this room. She pulled up a new file on her display and began drafting evacuation orders for her staff, calmly and methodically, the way a person does when they have decided that being somewhere else in the near future is a matter of serious priority. The young Pelushian watched her and did not understand why his hands had begun to sweat. On the morning of the second day, Calder submitted a formal request for a private audience with High Counselor Vrethon. He submitted it through the standard diplomatic channels, in proper form, with the correct compact protocols attached. He described himself, accurately, as a senior attaché of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, requesting a courtesy, meeting under Article 7 of the Compact's Detained Personnel Guidelines, which entitled any member of a detained envoy's staff to make one formal representation to the detaining party. The Dominion's Protocol Office, to its credit, processed the request in under an hour. There was some internal debate. Calder was, officially, nobody significant. An aide, unarmed, unranked, the kind of background figure that appeared in thousands of diplomatic missions without ever warranting individual attention. But refusing the request would have been a minor compact violation, and the Vreth Dominion was already absorbing considerable diplomatic criticism over the seizure itself. Granting a meeting with an aide cost them nothing. They granted it. Vrethon received him in her private council chamber, a smaller room off the main conclave floor, functional rather than ceremonial, with a long table and the kind of lighting designed to remind visitors of exactly where power sat. 2 armed guards stood inside the door. 3 more waited outside. The High Counselor herself was flanked by her Chief of Staff and her senior legal advisor, both present to record anything said. Calder walked in, thanked the guards at the door by name, which surprised them, since he had learned their names in under a day, and sat down across from Vrethon without being invited to do so. It was, technically, a breach of protocol. Vrethon decided not to mention it. He sat for a moment without speaking, not with discomfort or hesitation, but with the quality of someone who understood that silence was also a form of communication, and who was choosing his carefully. Then he spoke. "I'm going to tell you what I am," he said. "Not what I'm listed as in your files or in the Compact's rosters, but what I actually am. I'm telling you because you deserve the information before you make your next decision, and because I have always, every time, given the party in your position this opportunity." Vrethon's legal advisor started to object. Calder looked at him briefly, not unkindly, and the advisor found that he had decided not to finish the sentence. "Humanity does not send soldiers to protect its diplomats," Calder continued, his voice unhurried, conversational. "It doesn't need to. What it sends is me. I have been present at every human diplomatic mission of consequence for longer than your civilization has kept written records. My function is straightforward. I stand beside the diplomat. While I am standing beside them, they are safe, not because I prevent harm through force, but because my presence means that harm has already been weighed and found to be a catastrophically poor decision." Vrethon studied him. He did not look like a weapon. He did not move like one. He looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet, lean man in gray, with unremarkable features and old eyes. "And when harm comes to the diplomat despite you?" she asked, with the tone of someone who had decided to engage with the performance. "Then I stop standing beside them," Calder said simply, "and I begin standing somewhere else." He let that settle. Then, "I am asking you once, and I will not ask again after this conversation. Release Envoy Solène. Issue your retraction. There is still a version of this situation in which the Vreth Dominion continues to exist in its current form. I am genuinely, sincerely offering you that version right now, and I want you to understand that this offer expires when I leave this room." Silence. Vrethon leaned back. She looked at her chief of staff, who gave a subtle, dismissive gesture. She looked at her legal advisor, who had recovered enough to look skeptical. "Escort the attaché out," she said. "Thank him for his time." Calder rose, inclined his head with what appeared to be genuine courtesy, and thanked the guards on his way out as well. He did not seem angry. He did not seem frustrated. He seemed, the guards would both later say, like someone who had expected exactly this answer, and had asked anyway, because that was simply what he did. Because he always asked once. Counselor Evith spent most of the second night reading the still water files, and by morning she looked like someone who had not slept and had no intention of trying. She found the other senior delegates in the observer gallery's private lounge just before the third session was called: the Oran ambassador Tessavail, the Pelushian delegate Councillor Brem, the senior representative of the Harath Communion, and three others whose civilizations had been in the compact long enough to have their own sealed files that touched the same events. She closed the door. She set her personal display on the table. She said, "I need you to hear this." Then she read. The Keth sovereignty had been, in its prime, a civilization of 11 systems, roughly the same scale as the Vreth Dominion. Highly militarized, politically aggressive, with a strategic doctrine built on the concept of acceptable friction. The idea that other civilizations would absorb a certain level of coercion before the cost of resistance outweighed the cost of compliance. By their own models, detaining a human envoy for 2 to 3 weeks while issuing a list of demands was firmly within the acceptable friction band. They had detained Envoy Callum Reyes for 11 days. The records from those 11 days were ordinary: diplomatic protests, compact resolutions, human government statements that were measured and, notably, some analysts had thought at the time, too calm. The aide listed in the Keth records as a civilian attaché of no military significance had spent the 11 days in the conclave's visitor quarters, eating meals in the public commissary, occasionally walking the corridors of the station, occasionally sitting for hours in the observation deck watching the stars. No communications flagged. No suspicious activity detected. On day 12, the Keth sovereignty's primary communication relay, a deep space installation that had been operational for 60 years without recorded fault, experienced a catastrophic systems failure of undetermined origin. All three of the sovereignty's colony worlds reported simultaneous failures in their primary power infrastructure within the same 36-hour window. The sovereignty's civilian government, which had been functionally stable for decades, fractured along pre-existing political lines with a speed that no external analysis had predicted, and the fragmentation fed on itself. The Keth sovereignty did not end in war. It ended in a cascade, each failure isolating the next system, each isolation breeding the local resentments that had been managed, barely, for generations, until there was nothing left to hold them in check. Within 14 months, the 11-system civilization had dissolved into 7 quarreling successor states that would spend the next century fighting over the pieces. The human envoy had been released on day 11, just before the relay failed. The aide had been photographed at the departure terminal, boarding the human shuttle, carrying nothing, wearing gray. 17 incidents, Edith said. 17 over 3 centuries, different civilization, different contexts, different provocations. In every single case, a human diplomat was detained or harmed. In every single case, the responsible party experienced a cascade of failures that the still water analysis describes as, she looked down at the text, consistent with systemic entropy acceleration of undetermined mechanism, meaning things simply started breaking. Not dramatically, not all at once, just persistently, cumulatively, without obvious cause. The room was very quiet. The smallest incident was a planetary governor who had a human trade envoy briefly imprisoned for political theater, Edith continued. His government collapsed within 8 months. The largest, she paused. The largest was the Mevari Stellar Compact, 32 systems. They executed a human ambassador in 2098 in a public demonstration of sovereignty. They ceased to exist as a unified political entity within 2 years. There are 4 successor cultures currently occupying their former space. None of them have any institutional memory of why their predecessor fell. Councillor Brem, the young Pelushian, had gone completely silent. His earlier skepticism had not so much faded as been surgically removed. The aide, Tessavail said, it was not a question. Present in every incident, Edith confirmed. Always listed as civilian staff, always unremarkable, always photographed departing just before things begin to fail. She looked around the table. and he is currently in this building in the public commissary having breakfast. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then the Hareth representative said, very quietly, "We have to tell the Vreth Dominion." Evith shook her head slowly. "We have to decide whether telling them changes anything," she said, "and whether being the people who told them is a position we want to be in when this is over." Nothing exploded. Nothing caught fire. There were no incursions, no attacks, no dramatic gestures of any kind from the direction of human space. This was, in retrospect, the detail that should have alarmed the Vreth Dominion most of all. But alarming is difficult when nothing appears to be happening, and the Dominion's security apparatus was built to detect things that were happening, not things that were quietly failing to remain stable. It began on day 3. The water reclamation AI for the Citadel's residential quarter, a system that had been running without incident for 22 years, developed a fault in its primary calibration matrix that its engineers described in their incident report as statistically implausible given the system's maintenance history. The fault was minor. It was corrected in 4 hours. It was logged and forgotten. On day 4, a border relay station at the edge of the Vreth home system went dark for 6 hours. Full blackout, no signal, no telemetry, no emergency beacon. When it came back online, its logs for the preceding 6 hours were absent, not corrupted. Absent as though the time had simply not been recorded. The engineers submitted 3 competing theories and none of them fully explained it. The incident was flagged, investigated, and quietly shelved when no cause was found. On day 5, 3 senior counselors reported to medical facilities with unrelated issues: a circulatory irregularity, a neurological stress event, and what was ultimately diagnosed as severe exhaustion. Each case was individually unremarkable. The Dominion's chief medical officer, who happened to see all 3 files cross her desk on the same afternoon, noted the coincidence in her personal log and then decided she was being irrational. On day 6, the Dominion's external intelligence network, its deep cover assets embedded throughout compact space, began returning anomalous data. Not false data, not obviously compromised data, just data that felt slightly off in ways that were difficult to articulate, timing inconsistencies, source confirmations that arrived fractionally late, behavioral predictions from long-established informants that were subtly, puzzlingly wrong. Senior intelligence officers flagged the anomalies. A review was ordered. The review found nothing actionable. Through all of it, Calder moved through the Citadel's public spaces with complete unhurriedness. He was seen each morning in the commissary at the same time, eating the same meal, something grain-based, accompanied by tea, which he appeared to source from a small vendor stall near the conclave's east entrance. He nodded to guards he passed. He paused once to help a junior administrative aide retrieve a stack of documents that had scattered across the corridor floor, gathering them patiently and handing them back with a small, polite smile. He sat for 3 hours on the 4th day in the conclave's public observation deck, hands folded in his lap, watching the stars. 2 of the guards assigned to passive observation of him submitted reports, nodding that he had done nothing whatsoever. Their supervisor filed the reports under inconclusive and told them to keep watching. On day 7, Vrethon ordered a full security sweep of the Citadel's systems, all of them simultaneously, the most comprehensive diagnostic the Dominion's infrastructure had ever undergone. It ran for 14 hours and returned clean results across every category. No intrusion, no malware, no sabotage, no external interference of any documented type. The failures continued. A secondary power conduit in the Eastern Administrative Wing flickered for 40 minutes and then stabilized without explanation. A senior admiral's personal communication channel experienced a 2-day outage that his technical staff attributed to hardware degradation, and then quietly stopped attributing to anything when the hardware tested as fully functional. In 3 separate client states, local governors reported unusual upticks in civil unrest. Nothing serious, nothing that wouldn't have happened eventually anyway, but happening now all at once without obvious catalyst. Vrethon stood at her window on the evening of day 7 and looked out at the citadel's lights and told herself that she was not frightened, that the failures were coincidences, that the communique from Earth with its 3 minimal sentences meant nothing, that the aide in gray, buying tea from the vendor stall in the East Corridor, was nobody. She told herself these things carefully and precisely. Then she called for a full council session and told her staff she needed the room sealed and that she needed everyone present. She was already starting to notice who hesitated when they answered. The cracks, when they came, did not announce themselves. They never did. On day 9, 2 junior counselors, Vreth Soa and Vreth Malin, both relatively recent appointments, both from client-state families with more to lose from compact exclusion than from internal Dominion politics, contacted the neutral observer delegation separately, within hours of each other, and asked to make formal statements. They submitted, between them, 114 pages of documented testimony regarding the planning and execution of Envoy Solen's seizure, meeting records, internal communications, the intelligence assessment that had classified a human diplomat as a low-risk political tool, and the names of every counselor who had voted to approve the operation. They also submitted something that no one had asked for, and that made every legal officer in the observer delegation go quiet: a partial copy of the Stillwater designation's public access summary, which they had apparently found in the compact's secondary archives without the high-level clearance Evith had needed, suggesting that someone had recently, quietly, left a door open. Vrethon did not learn about the testimonies until they had already been formally received by the observer delegation, at which point they were protected under compact evidentiary protocols and could not be withdrawn. She learned about them on the evening of day 9 from her chief of staff, who delivered the information with the expression of someone handing over a lit explosive. Day 10 arrived, and things became worse. 3 of the Dominion's fleet admirals, the commanders of the 1st Perimeter Fleet, the Home Defense Contingent, and the Strategic Reserve, independently submitted requests for fleet repositioning, not toward human space, away from Vreth space, on vectors that, when plotted, described neither patrol routes nor training exercises, but rather the kind of personal exit geometry that experienced military officers maintained when they had quietly decided that a situation was about to become unsurvivable. All 3 requests were submitted through proper channels, within regulations, impossible to deny without escalating the signal they were sending. 2 of them had already begun moving their ships before the requests were approved. Vrethon called a crisis session of the full council at midday. 12 of the 22 counselors appeared. Of the remaining 10, 4 submitted medical excuses, 3 submitted security concerns, and 3 simply did not respond. The 4 who cited medical excuses were, by Dominion medical records, all in excellent health. The 3 with security concerns had not filed anything through the formal security office. At the session, Vrethon outlined a path forward: hold firm, accelerate the timeline, issue a counter-statement to the compact challenging the evidentiary status of the testimonies. She spoke with authority and conviction, because she had always spoken with authority and conviction, because in her experience that was what held rooms together. Halfway through, one of the present counselors interrupted to ask whether anyone had noticed that the Citadel's intelligence network had gone silent. Not compromised, not hacked, not producing corrupted data. Silent. As in, it had simply stopped returning data, full stop, as though it had looked at the current situation and made a considered decision to withdraw cooperation. The room went cold. That was when Vrethon checked the conclave's corridor feeds. She had started doing this instinctively, several days ago, without fully acknowledging why. She found the East Corridor feed and there was Calder, standing near the vendor stall, not buying tea this time but simply standing, looking down the corridor toward the council chamber's sealed door. The vendor was gone, had apparently packed up and left sometime in the past hour. Calder stood alone in the corridor, hands clasped loosely, and he was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the door as though he could see through it, as though he was watching them. Vrethon was not a person who frightened easily. She had clawed her way through Dominion politics for 30 years, had survived 2 assassination attempts and 1 full council coup, had stared down warlords and arbitrageurs and the kinds of bureaucratic predators that made open warfare look cordial. She did not frighten easily. But she closed the feed, and she found that she could not reopen it. "Call a recess," she told her chief of staff. "For how long?" She didn't answer immediately. She was thinking about the Keth sovereignty, about 11 days, about what Calder had said in this very building 3 days ago. There is still a version of this situation in which the Vreth Dominion continues to exist in its current form. 3 days ago, that had sounded like theater. It no longer sounded like theater. "Indefinite recess," she said, "and get me a direct line to our legal team, the full team." She paused. "And find out who still answers when we call them." Mara Solin was released on the morning of the 11th day. There was no ceremony to it, no formal occasion, no prepared statement, no gathered audience. Vrethon came in person, which was unusual, and which told Mara more about the past 11 days than anything else could have, and she came with a small staff and no guards, which told her even more. The High Counselor's retraction document was already prepared, already signed, a remarkably complete instrument that conceded not just the seizure, but the legitimacy of the original water rights framework that had precipitated it. Someone in Dominion Legal had worked through the night to produce it, and they had produced it with the thoroughness of people who understood that thoroughness was now the most important thing they could offer. Vrethon presented it without a speech. She signed the final confirmation in front of 2 compact witnesses. She met Mara's eyes, and something moved behind her own that Mara found difficult to name, not defeat, not quite shame, but a specific, heavy kind of comprehension. The look of someone who had finally located the shape of the thing they'd been standing in front of and understood belatedly how large it was. "I hope," Vrethon said very quietly, "that we understand each other now." Mara looked at her for a moment. Then, "I hope so too," she said. She meant it without cruelty, which took some effort, because her wrists were still marked from the restraints, and she had spent 11 days eating commissary food in a secure room. But she meant it genuinely, because she was a diplomat, and because she understood that the Vreth Dominion still needed to exist, and still needed a way to exist, without becoming an example that every other civilization in the compact studied in hushed tones. She gathered what remained of her documents and walked out of the holding room and into the corridor. Calder was waiting at the conclave's main entrance with 2 cups of tea. He handed her one without comment. She accepted it without comment. They fell into step together, the way they always had, him 1 step behind her left shoulder, and walked toward the shuttle bay through corridors that were conspicuously, deliberately empty of Dominion personnel. The guards who might have been posted at various checkpoints were not posted. The administrative staff who might have been moving through the halls were not moving through the halls. The Vreth Citadel, which had 23,000 personnel, had arranged itself to be unoccupied between Mara's holding room and her shuttle, an act of institutional will that required considerable coordination and communicated volumes about the past 48 hours. They passed through the main doors into the outer conclave, where the observer delegations were gathered. Nobody spoke. The Shivari elder Evith stood near the front, holding her personal display, and she watched Calder the way an experienced scientist watches a phenomenon they have studied for years and are finally seeing at close range. He looked back at her as they passed, just a brief glance, unhurried, acknowledging. Something passed between them that was not words. Evith looked down at her display and began typing. At the shuttle bay, Mara's staff fell in around her, quiet with the particular relief of people who had spent 11 days managing their own fear very carefully. She let them manage her for a moment, medic check, status rundown, the gentle logistical fussing of professionals who needed to do something useful. Calder stood a few steps apart, finishing his tea, looking out through the bay's wide viewport at Vreth space. You could have ended it sooner, Mara said, quietly enough that only he could hear. I offered them the chance to end it on day 2, Calder said. That's not what I meant. Calder considered this. No, he said, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. She'll be a better high counselor for it, that matters. Mara looked at him sidelong. Does it to you? Everything matters, he said simply. Every civilization that continues is one that might, eventually, become something remarkable. I've watched long enough to believe that. She didn't answer. The shuttle's boarding light came on. In the compact's secured archive, later that week, Edith uploaded the completed version of what she had been typing since the conclave doors. It was not a threat assessment or a political brief. It was a note, addressed to no specific recipient, filed under the still water designation for the benefit of whoever would open it next, in whatever century that turned out to be. It read, in its entirety, "The aide is not an enforcer. He is not a weapon, not in any sense we have words for. He is something older, a marker, a line drawn in the visible universe. When you see him standing beside a diplomat, understand that you are being offered something, the chance to make the right choice before the choice is made for you. He will ask once. He will be courteous. He will mean every word. Do not make the mistake of hearing courtesy and concluding that nothing is at stake. Every civilization that has made that mistake is now a historical footnote studied by civilizations that learned their lesson secondhand. The line is not there to threaten you. It is there because humanity, a long time ago, decided that the universe should have at least one line that cannot be crossed without consequence, and that the consequence should be patient enough to wait however long patience requires." She sealed the file. She forwarded it to every senior delegate in the compact with active security clearance, without explanation or cover note. 3 months later, Envoy Mara Solen arrived at the Pelushian Convergence Summit on a routine trade mission. She came aboard a modest shuttle, no escort, no weapons array. Calder stood one step behind her left shoulder. The assembled delegations, every single one of them, were very, very polite.